Hello and welcome to an introduction to forecasting. In this video we'll do kind of an overview of why forecasting matters, why we teach it in the context of operations management, although we use it in a wide variety of contexts, and it's probably the skill or the knowledge that is one of the most likely for you to apply as a business student going forward. So this video will sort of give the overview of why forecasting is important, what it is, why we use it. The second video will give kind of an overview of forecasting techniques. It is complemented by 3 example videos that I've already posted that show examples of how to calculate and apply some of these approaches. The last video will be on monitoring and measuring forecasts. How do we evaluate whether we're doing a good job on forecasting, and what are some of the tools we have, and it's also complemented by a video that shows some examples of using and applying those tools. So let's get right to it here. What is forecasting? It is kind of a process of predicting a future event. It is anticipating what might happen in your business. So we can forecast sales, we can forecast production requirements, we can forecast consumer visits, all of these things which provide us with insight that we can use to order ingredients, to schedule workers, to plan investment, a whole variety of things that become important decisions that managers and companies make and are supported by the process of forecasting in an attempt to understand better where we'll be in the future so that we can respond to wherever that is. And really it underlies, as I've said already, the basis of all the business decisions: production, inventory, personnel, facilities investments. All of those things are based on a foundation of our expectation of what's going to happen. And so that's why forecasting is so important. Companies value forecasting highly. They spend a lot of time on it. They use different tools. They use quantitative approaches. They use qualitative approaches. And as managers, again, this is a circumstance where a number can give you insight, but it can't make a decision for you. So forecasting numbers help, but they don't necessarily make the entire decision for you. So let's use an example of Walt Disney Parks and Resorts. They have a bunch of parks around the world. They make money from people coming to visit them, and their revenues are driven by how many visitors and how much money they spend when they are on the resort. And so some of those are strategic operations decisions. They make some pricing decisions where you get deals if you stay on the resort. They make operational decisions where they have buses to drive you from the airport to their resorts so that you don't rent a car. And if you don't rent a car, you don't spend any time off the resort. So they do some really good things from a revenue management perspective, but all of those again are built on a foundation of an understanding of who's going to come. So understanding that revenue line, how many people are coming, how they're going to spend the money, how much money they're going to spend, but forecasting also underlies the cost side. How many staff should we have? Should we be building more? Should we be revising the content in our parks, the rides, and all of those sorts of things? So you know, when you have a daily management report at Disney, only contains forecast and actual attendance at each park. So they clearly focus on those. So anticipating that, forecasting that, becomes pretty accurate, and they evaluate themselves by saying, this is what we thought was going to happen, this is what actually happened, and that becomes an important consideration. Disney does short-term forecasts, medium-term forecasts, and longer-term forecasts. And you use those forecasts for different reasons. A daily forecast will be for how much staff should we have on, how much inventory should we order to food service, how much of each individual. So daily forecasts are much more granular. They are sort of the operational details. Whereas if you get to a 5-year forecast, that's overall, how do we think demand is going to look? We're not forecasting 5 years out things like how many small coffees, medium coffees, and large coffees, or how many of this flavor of ice cream that we may do in a daily. But in a 5-year forecast, we'll do things like how many people overall do we see coming? Do we need to do things to expand or think about investment so that we keep people coming to the park? So the longer term forecasts are more higher level. The shorter term forecasts are more granular operational type decisions. Labor management, maintenance, operation, finance, park scheduling. Forecasts are used in all aspects of the business. Doesn't say marketing here, but Disney, if they anticipate a decrease, may actually increase their investment in marketing just to get more people coming to the park. And they do adjust opening times, rides, shows, staffing levels, and guest admin. So because it's important to them, Disney has a very complex forecasting system. They have to think that 20% of their customers come from outside of the US. That includes Canadians. And so they have a very complex model that includes economic activity. As economic activity improves, more people travel. They look at exchange rates. They look at travel to and from the US. So is there a trend that people are coming to the US that makes them more likely to come to one of their parks? And so they look at a whole bunch of factors and that may have a relationship to people coming, and use those to predict how many people are going to come to their parks. They have, in fact, 35 analysts, or more than 35 analysts, and 70 people in the field to survey over 1 million park guests, employees, and travel professionals every year. So they don't just look at the numbers; they actually look at, if you will, the qualitative aspects, what people are saying to them, and in order to get a really good understanding and a foundation on which to build their decisions. So forecasting is a complex and critical function in any organizations. And in the shorter term, they look at things like airline specials, monetary policy, Wall Street trends, vacation, holiday schedules for 3,000 school districts around the world. So they look at when spring break happens, as an example. They look at when universities have reading week. All of those things begin to influence their forecasts. And to give you a sense of how well they do is their average forecast error in the long term is about 5%. So that's their 5-year forecast, which has the least certainty that it is toughest to predict further out. And their average forecast for annuals their average error for annual forecast is between 0 and 3%. So the time and effort they're investing in their forecasts is really paying off because it's accurate, and forecasting effectively saves companies money. I like to tell the story. I was early in my career, I was a product manager for a company, and when I was promoted to marketing manager, I thought, yes, I am a great marketing guy. I'm running great campaigns, and my boss said, yeah, you're pretty good. But what you really stand out is that forecasting, and that's why we're promoting you. We want you to help our broader department improve its forecasts, because that makes us a ton of money. Doing that effectively, particularly with perishable products, becomes an important driver of both revenue and cost reduction. So forecasting really matters. So what are some of the things, and we've talked about this a little bit already. We have short range forecasts up to a year, generally less than 3 months. Yeah, they're purchasing, job scheduling, workforce levels, job assignments, production levels. So these are sort of more granular forecasts that really drive day-to-day operations in our business. So, if I was to contrast that with a longer range forecast, 3+ years, new product planning, facility location, research and development. So, if I'm at Tim Hortons as an example I like to use, if I'm forecasting out 3 or more years, I'm looking at overall coffee demand, what the demand for lunch and and dinners and breakfasts will be, and where that demand might occur as I decide whether I'm going to build new locations or close some locations down. What might be a new product that we can launch. Whereas in the short term, we'll be forecasting how many large cups do we need for next week? How many small cups do we need for next week? How many of this kind of sandwich are we going to use, and how much of this kind of sandwich, so we have those ingredients ready to do. The 3+ year forecast might say we expect 1 million visitors per store. The short range forecast might say, well, we're expecting 1,000 people to come in or to come through our drive-through on Monday morning, so we need to have enough people that we can manage that staff. We need to produce enough muffins and have enough coffee on hand that we can do to meet that individual demand. So that's kind of the difference between the different horizons for forecasting. And I think we've talked about this a little bit already, so I'm going to go through it relatively quick. Long-term forecasts deal with more comprehensive issues and support management decision regarding planning, products, plants, and process, whereas the short-term employ different methodologies, and really they tend to be more accurate because there's more information and there's less time for situations to change, and they tend to be more granular, as I said before. And there are a bunch of factors. We talked about vacation schedules. We talked about a product life cycle also matters. We have to anticipate growth, and at the end of a product life cycle, we also have to anticipate decline. And so we do that with production levels, inventory levels, capacity planning. If this product is in decline, do we have another product coming in that will employ that capacity? And we're seeing that in the automotive industry, where they're saying, well, this type of car is becoming less popular. We either need to shut down that production, which we've seen some of the big car companies threaten, or we need to divert that production to another type of vehicle, and that takes some time. So that's why we do those sorts of long-term forecasts, to start to anticipate those investment and capacity management decisions. So we have a variety of different types of forecasts that we need to think about. Economic forecasts, what's going to happen, inflation rate, money supply, housing starts. Those are sort of real factors that affect demand more broadly. So we anticipate some of those sorts of things. Now, clearly, some things are easier to anticipate. We know we predict business cycles reasonably accurately. Things like the COVID pandemic came out of the blue and significantly affected demand, in some cases positively, in some cases negatively. So you can't always anticipate these things, but we do those economic forecasts in an effort to do that. Technological forecasts, the rate of progress, we're making investments in capacity, how are things going to change? I spoke the other day to a grocery company, and they talked about the fact that they have to think about how big demand for online groceries and delivery is going to be, and then they have to think about what technology makes the most sense to deliver the kinds of customer experiences that their customers are expecting. So some companies are investing in highly technical, robot-driven distribution centers where they can pick an order of 50 items in less than 5 minutes, and other stores are saying, no, we're going to pick those orders out of our stores, and that's going to be our priority and our platform. And so they have to predict how many people are going to demand or look at online groceries, but they also have to predict how technology will allow us to do that. And then demand forecasts, predict sales of existing products and new products or services. I think I've already talked about this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Strategic importance of forecasting, hiring, training, schedule, laying off workers, capacity shortages can result in undependable delivery, loss of customers, loss of market share. Capacity excess can also cost you a lot of money. If you have capacity that you've invested in and you don't have the demand to use that capacity, that is just as much of a problem as shortages and supply chain management. That forecasting can also reduce costs throughout the supply chain by allowing us to interact and talk about what some of the differences are. So there are 7 steps in forecasting. First we have to think about why are we forecasting? What decision are we looking to support here? And that will drive what we forecast. It will also drive the tools we use to forecast it. So then we say, why are we doing it? What do we forecast in order to do that effectively, and over what timeline in order to support the decision that we have to drive? Given all of that, that sets the context where we then say, what approach are we going to use? And usually it is which approaches are we going to use. We rarely see companies use just one narrow approach to forecasting. I know when I was working, my forecasting, the quantitative element of our software would spit out 3 or 4 different forecasts. And the truth is, while in most operations management courses you're going to be asked to hand calculate some, you're not generally going to do that. If you work for a small company, you might be doing forecasting in Excel or some other support tool. If you work for a large company, they probably have enterprise management software which will spit out forecasts. You need to understand how those forecasts are formed, what they mean, in order for you to interpret and assess the validity of that forecast. And so you will often use several different models, including qualitative ones. You then gather the data, make the forecast, and again, I think that this is an important distinction. You apply the model. You might get something spit out, but you then might adjust it because you say, oh, I anticipate this change that's not reflected in the historical data, or this change that our competitor is exiting the market and our demand might go up. So the forecast is different than the number that a model spits out. It is your management insight that finalizes the forecast, and then you validate and implement the results. And validate means, are we doing a good job? So we are constantly monitoring the effectiveness of our forecasting approaches. So all of that sounds great. Disney does a good job. What we need to understand is forecasts are almost always wrong. Something comes up, there's just natural variation. We saw that when we talked about statistical process control. We assume that nothing's changing, but we know that things are always changing. But the fact that they're always wrong does not give us an excuse to just throw up our hands and say there's nothing we can do. It means we continue to try and get better, and then we also acknowledge that having a less than perfect forecast is better than having no forecast at all. So most techniques assume an underlying stability in the system that doesn't exist, and that's the qualitative aspect or the management insight aspect of determining a forecast. And product family and aggregated forecasts are more accurate than individual product forecasts. It will be easier a year out for Tim Hortons to say how much coffee are we going to sell next January than it is to say how many large double-doubles are we going to sell next year versus how many medium black are we going to sell dark roast, regular, all of those things, the more granular it gets, the more difficult it is, the less accurate you're going to be. So just before I wrap up, I thought I'd just talk a little bit about forecasting in the service sector, because again, many of you are going to work in the service sector, and it highlights some of the differences. And frankly, the service sector is almost tougher to forecast, but also more important to forecast than say production, because we can't inventory service, right? So if we schedule people for service roles and no one comes in, we still need to pay them, and when they come in again tomorrow, we need to pay them again. So it's more important that we're accurate. We also have more variability in the experience of service, so it's much sort of less tangible and more difficult to forecast, and that also becomes important. For example, a grocery store might forecast how long it takes to check someone out. Well, there are factors that can affect, we've all ended up at the grocery store stuck behind the person who has 17 coupons that they're all trying to get scanned. That becomes difficult to predict when that's going to happen. Holidays and other calendar events become more important, and then there are also unusual events that not least COVID, that come into play. So also, there's much more variability. So this is demand in a fast food restaurant, and you can see that if we just forecasted demand during the day, we would lose the fact that we have this cyclicality, or almost seasonality in demand. So, in this particular restaurant, we have almost 20% of demand between 12 and 1 o'clock. Then in the afternoon, it's quiet. Dinner becomes more, and then in the evening, it's quiet again. So we then have to think about how we're going to schedule people. We often in restaurants don't have a lot of storage capacity, so we may need to have an order come in at 10:30 and then another order come in, particularly since the menu is often different, at 3:30. So thinking about that becomes much more important and much more difficult in the context. If I was a phone store, as an example, I might have demand that looks like this, but because I have phones in, I could get phones in the morning. It doesn't matter when people come and get them, as long as I have enough phones. But here I have to have people to make that food, and so I have to ride those waves much more directly. And so again, it becomes more difficult, but also more important in a service context. And this is the same sort of thing. This is a call center, and we have to have people on. We don't want people waiting. I've had experiences where it seems that they don't care that we wait, but they do try and manage that expectation, manage capacity. And so you could say we get 1,000 calls a day, and that doesn't tell you the information as to when you need operators or customer service reps on. So again, a customer service call, a service call, is not something that we can inventory. If this was people coming in to buy phones again, as long as we had enough phones to get through that wave, we might have an issue of staff being required right here, and so we have to manage capacity so that we can meet most of that demand, but we might have a few too many people down here, and we have to define some other tasks for them to work on. But in this circumstance, we need, because our only product is that service, we need to reflect that in the demand. We need to reflect that variation in demand in our scheduling and offering of service. So that gives you a quick introduction to forecasting. Forecasting is fundamental to the operations of businesses. It becomes a strategic, an important strategic input, whether it's long-term or short-term, and it's used across the board in all aspects of the company. So no matter where you work after graduation as a business student, you will be required to forecast at some point. So spending time and attention to learning this, I think, is critically important.